My name is Connor Ruby, and this will be my original oratory on why we should abolish the private prison system. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What's the price tag on a life? Can you sell a future? Where can the line be drawn? I may be directing these questions at you for the moment, but who we should really be directing these questions at is companies who support the practice of putting a price tag on the lives of the incarcerated. These companies include Group Incorporated, otherwise known as GEO, that run these facilities. Companies that support and fund these businesses, including BlackRock and Vanguard. And finally, CoreCivic, the largest for-profit prison company in America. Corrections Corporations of America, now known as CoreCivic, was first founded in January of 1983 during the middle of the war on drugs. As in any time of crisis, businessmen saw an opportunity to cash in on the distress of the nation. Prisons were so overpopulated at the time that CoreCivic told the government that they could run some of the prisons, save the government some money, and even make a little for themselves. While this should have immediately set off some major red flags to any rational thinking person that a business was now running prisons, it didn't seem to faze the government, and CoreCivic is still a huge entity to this day. To be a prisoner does not mean you are no longer a person. You still have an inalienable value that cannot be taken away from you, no matter what. You're not a tool for someone's gain and should not be treated as a cog in a business model. But CoreCivic and these other companies are treating prisoners, treating people exactly this way. In 1988, CoreCivic co-founder Tom Beasley said, and I quote, "You just sell prisons like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers." He compares the selling of what's supposed to be a group of people trying to pay for their crimes, be better, and be reintegrated into society, to a simple hamburger? These executives are the people we're dealing with, and quite frankly, this has to stop. It's an awful business model that hurts so many, and for this, we should abolish private prisons. Now you may be thinking, sure, the business model sounds a bit fishy, but what's the real harm in all of this? That mindset, however, is the exact reason these companies have been able to stay in power for so long. So to explain, we'll start with a fundamental problem, the business model of for-profit prisons. There are a variety of ways private prisons maintain profits. One specific clause that many of the contracts between private prisons and federal and state governments include is a minimum occupancy clause. This clause states the government contracting with a prison must maintain a specific percentage of occupancy, meaning that if they had fewer prisoners, they would still need to pay the difference between the minimum number agreed upon and the new smaller number of incarcerated people. A version of this clause used by prisons is a paradigm rate clause, which establishes high fixed paradigms rate per person housed in the prison up to a specified percentage of prison occupancy, then a lower fixed paradigm rate for every individual past that threshold percentage. In 2011, a private prison in Arizona didn't reach its 97% capacity quota, so the state government had to pay them a $3 million fine. These fines incentivize keeping prisoners in the facility for as long as possible, for fear of having to pay an exorbitant amount of money that the state quite simply can't afford. This means that those who prove to be model prisoners and could be could be released from a public prison for good behavior, reintegrated into society, are unjustly kept in these facilities to meet minimum quotas and avoid fines. This tactic alone should show you how far these people are willing to go to make money, but there are several other problems with this model. Another problem with the for-profit prison system is how they cut costs in exchange for safety and any livable quality of life. Alex Friedman was transferred to a Tennessee government prison in 1998 after having spent the previous 6 years incarcerated in a private facility. He told the public that they had more blankets, the toilet paper wasn't as cheap, and correctional officers were everywhere. Quote, "First thing I noticed was there was a heck of a lot more boots on the ground in the public prisons. There wasn't such an emphasis on cutting costs." After being released in 1999, Friedman, now the associate director of the Human Rights Defense Center, began fighting for the abolition of private prisons and has spent the past 2 decades doing so. The argument against them, according to Friedman, are clear. The for-profit model encourages the businesses to cut corners, affecting inmate safety and quality of living. Activists found lots of problems, with one particularly being the quality of the staff. Not only were there fewer correctional officers, but they were also trained less than officers at a public prison. Low pay rates led to frequent turnover, and a lack of experienced officers directly impacted the inmates' quality of life. Friedman said, and I quote, "I recall one incident where a prisoner set fire within his cell. Smoke was billowing out of it. He was locked inside. The guard, instead of letting the guy out, or calling for help just held the door shut so he couldn't get out. And that might have been because she was the only staff member in the unit, and she wasn't so afraid, and she'd be afraid if she'd let the guy out, he might overpower her or something. But he basically just let him burn. While this did not directly result in the loss of life of this inmate, he was still horribly burned, and all because these private prison companies were too cheap. CoreCivic's annual report revealed that their profit margin was $1.7 billion in 2015. I'd like to repeat that number. $1.7 billion, and they couldn't even make sure they had enough staff to ensure that some man wouldn't be horribly burned. This is awful, and should stop. Another way private prisons are able to keep so many in their facilities is the unprecedented number of infractions they give out. A study by the School of Business at the University of Wisconsin in 2016 found that private prisons give out as many as double the infractions as comparison to a normal prison. These secret infractions can really be given out for any reason. While an infraction could reasonably be given out for fighting, they are often given to people prison guards just don't want to deal with, including the mentally ill, LGBTQ+, and absurd reasons like prisoners simply didn't want to eat dinner. Infractions can lengthen a prisoner's sentence, making these companies even more money, which provides a clear incentive to give them out. Infractions also led to a higher use of solitary confinement. According to a study done by The Guardian, at some for-profit facilities, brand new inmates were automatically placed in solitary confinement as a way of combating overcrowding rather than a disciplinary issue. In fact, the same Guardian study also found that low-risk prisoners at for-profit facilities are 9 times more likely to be put in solitary confinement than those at government facilities. And this isn't by accident. Private facilities cut costs by not having to pay to build more cells, torturing people to cut costs. It was originally introduced, solitary confinement, by Quakers in the 1800s under the belief that prisoners would use the time in solitary to study the Bible. However, even they decided it was too cruel to use, and in 1890, the Supreme Court found that prisoners subjected to solitary confinement became violently insane, and others still committed suicide. Solitary confinement fell out of use in the US for almost a century, but a few decades ago, we brought it back, and for-profit prisons have just used it as another tool for their gain. Innately, humans are social animals, but in solitary confinement, you're kept alone for 23 hours a day in a room the size of a king-size bed. This has many adverse effects on the prisoner's mental health, including mental health complications, such as depression, hallucinations, and thoughts of suicide. However, to men like Tom Beasley and other companies like this, it's perfectly justifiable as long as it can make them some money. Right? Right? No. To think this is essentially giving up your humanity, actively deciding to trade lives for riches. All this profit, yet CoreCivic and these other large for-profit companies can't even do the thing they said they were going to, save the government some money. In a New York Times article published in 2011, it was found that for-profit prisons cost taxpayers just as much as government-run ones. For-profit prisons also are not solving anything. For one study by the NYU School of Law found that since 2000, the effect of the crime rate in increasing incarceration has been essentially zero. Secondly, the Washington Sentencing Project found that 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the US. That's 10 times the number 50 years ago. To put it into perspective, that's more than the population of some states. And the scary thing is that nearly 20% of all prisoners are held in for-profit facilities. And while this is all awful, horrible even, there is a silver lining. Lawmakers of states like California and Nevada have banned private prisons from operating within their state. Businesses are also increasingly cutting ties with the industry, following pushback from their customers. The number of inmates in these facilities are also seeing a downward trend. In comparison to its peak in 2012 of about 136,220 people, the private prison population has decreased about 12% in the past 5 years, as more facilities are closing. Given private prisons rely on facilities being full to remain economically viable, there is concern among executives that these falling numbers could eventually drive these businesses to their demise. And this is all great, but unless we as a society decide to change how we house our prisoners, these for-profit facilities will never truly be wiped out. We should determine whether we want shareholders and profit margins directing decision-making for our prisons, or if there's a better policy to implement for prisoners and incarceration. So I once again ask, what's the price of a life? The answer to this question should be priceless, and for this reason, we should strive for a push to force these corporations to answer that question and shut down their facilities that make life a business. Thank you.